Mr. De Schutter is a renowned authority in the field of international human rights. He is the founder and coordinator of the EU Network of Independent Experts on Fundamental Rights and director of the International Center for the Teaching of Human Rights in Universities. Currently, he is also teaching at the University of Louvain and at the College of Europe. Mr. De Schutter was appointed UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food by the Human Rights Council in March 2008. As Special Rapporteur, he is independent from any government and serves in his individual capacity. This year, Mr. De Schutter made a country visit to Syria, and in December will visit the People's Republic of China. This morning, Mr. De Schutter presented his annual report to the Third Committee of the General Assembly. I'd like to ask you all to please switch off your cell phones, and I would now like to give the floor to Mr. De Schutter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and thanks to all for being here. Let me first recall what is the discussion currently about. There is lots of talk since a few months about disciplining land grabbing, the global enclosures movement, which we are witnessing, and in which governments or sovereign wealth funds, but especially domestic and foreign private investors, seek to appropriate land, farmland, that is useful to farmers, to fishers, to indigenous peoples for their livelihoods. They do this because they want to develop large-scale plantations for cash crops, because they want to develop the production of biofuels, energy crops, or simply because they speculate on farmland, since they know that farmland, fertile land, is becoming increasingly scarce, and thus, like fresh water, a strategic asset for the future. And finally, some of this land grabbing is the result of projects that seek to mitigate climate change, for example, the planting of forests in order to benefit from the clean development mechanism established by Article 12 of the Kyoto Protocol. To respond to this development, the World Bank, teaming with the FAO, UNCTAD, and the IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, put forward a number of principles for responsible agricultural development that respect rights, resources, and livelihoods. And those principles were presented at a side event to the high-level segment of the General Assembly of this year on the 24th of September. I am on record for having expressed my skepticism towards this initiative for three reasons. First, because these principles on responsible agricultural investment have been developed in a top-down fashion in a process which has not been inclusive. Second, because these principles on responsible agricultural investment are presented as voluntary, although states have human rights obligations, particularly towards the right to food. And that is the reason why I presented myself 11 principles which follow from the right to food, which I believe should be monitored by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the guardian of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And those principles I presented in March at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. Third, the principles on responsible agricultural investment give a very distorted view of the real choice facing governments. That choice is not between either accepting large-scale investments in land, with all the consequences it has for the local communities, or benefiting from no investment at all in agriculture. Instead, I believe investments should primarily be upstream and downstream the production process. They should allow to build storage facilities, develop communication routes, encourage cooperatives of producers to climb up the value chain by processing, by packaging, by marketing their produce. And I believe that it should involve better information about prices in order to strengthen the bargaining position of small farmers. In other terms, before imposing conditions on investors seeking to develop large-scale plantations, I believe that states should ask what is in their best interests and in those of the local communities. What kind of rural development do they want? Do they prefer to support small-scale farmers, or do they prefer to prioritize the development of large estates, which will increase the competition for land and water? In my view, states have a special responsibility in this regard because market mechanisms, if left to themselves, will favor the large plantations. The large plantations attract private investment much more easily. They are better at producing at a low cost with highly mechanized systems that economize on labor. They achieve better on markets, and they can be more competitive, particularly on export markets, since they comply more easily with the standards and volumes requirements of global supply chains. In contrast, the small-scale farmers, the smaller production units, produce positive externalities that the market all too often does not reward. They create employment. They contribute to rural development and thus to fighting rural poverty. They are better at preserving the ecosystems because they link the farmer to the land, allowing a much better complementarity between crops, trees, and small animals that fertilize the soils. So while focusing on access to land, the report I presented today places the question of land grabbing in a much broader framework, that of rural development. It asks, how can security of tenure be ensured that truly contributes to combating rural poverty? How does equitable access to land contribute to the realization of the right to food? And I come up with two main conclusions. First, in order to achieve security of tenure, titling schemes, i.e. the transposition of the Western concept of property rights, may not be the ideal solution. In many cases, titling schemes, the process of providing titles to the land that farmers till, has been captured by elites and increased inequality. Often, existing inequalities in access to land have been simply confirmed. Often, titling schemes have led to more legal insecurity as the titling process was in conflict with customary forms of tenure, creating an important legal uncertainty. Fourth, titling schemes encourage the creation of a market for land rights, but that in many countries has led to more concentration of land. Land does not go to those who need it most. Land does not go to those who can make the best use of it, the most productive use of it. It goes simply to those who can afford it, and indeed to those who can afford to speculate on it. Instead, my report insists on the need to protect land users from evictions by adopting anti-eviction laws as a first step. It insists, second, on protecting customary forms of tenure with certain safeguards in order to ensure that women and outsiders to the community will not be discriminated against or excluded from the process of certifying and confirming customary forms of tenure. And my report insists, third, on protecting the rights of tenants, those who work on the land even though they may not be the formal landowners. Those tenants should have a right to stay on the land despite shifts in land ownership. They should have the right as a spouse or as a hire to succeed to the tenant if the tenant deceases. They should have a right to acquire the land, exercising a right to preemption if the land is sold to someone else, for example, another investor. The report also has a chapter on agrarian reform, a promise that the international community has made in 2006, but which it seems in many respects to have now forgotten about. In the declaration which followed the International Conference on Agrarian Reform and Rural Development held in Porto Alegre in March 2006, states were encouraged to ensure a fairer, a more equitable distribution of land in countries where there are strong social inequalities. And I argue in my report that in situations where, first, there's a strong inequality in access to land, and I propose a measure, for example, 0.65 Gini coefficient in unequal distribution of land, the most unequal being 1, of course, and all land being concentrated in the hands of one person. And second, where a large number of people are hungry as a result of landlessness or because they have too little land to cultivate, in those countries, in those situations, where unequal ownership of land is leading to wide-scale hunger and malnutrition, I believe states should be obliged to promote agrarian reform. But it's important to insist, agrarian reform is not simply about redistributing land. And we've seen many examples of redistributions of land that have failed, sometimes lamentably in certain countries, because it was simply giving land away to small farmers without supporting them, without training them, without allowing them to achieve an increase in their incomes and to use the land productively. In fact, it's been estimated that in most agrarian reforms that have succeeded, particularly in the Asian regions, 60 to 70% of the costs of agrarian reform went to supporting production, to supporting farmers in their ability to produce, and not simply to redistribute land for their benefit. What are the next steps? I was last week in Rome, where I took part in the 36th session of the Committee on World Food Security as part of the Committee on World Food Security was reformed in November 2009 as it was found necessary to improve global governance of food security and improve the coordination across various processes that seek to combat food insecurity. And at this session, the CFS, the Committee on World Food Security, launched its work towards the adoption of voluntary guidelines for the responsible governance of the tenure of land and other natural resources. This is an inclusive process which has already begun at the regional level, and it shall be highly legitimate when it shall be completed by the adoption of these voluntary guidelines. I will work on this process. I hope that my report presented today will contribute to this process and that we can move further towards recognizing that access to land is part of what is needed to fully realize the right to food. And with this, I thank you for your attention, and I welcome, of course, your questions.
News agency. In a New York Times article, you noted that the 4-year drought in Syria has pushed 2 to 3 million people into extreme poverty, and the Syrian government has begun to acknowledge the scale of the problem and has developed a national drought plan, though it has not yet been put in place. Does the UN plan to get involved in this matter and to help?
Well, I'm not speaking for the UN agencies who are working on the ground, but I did indeed witness that work and the difficulties they are facing. What we have is the following situation. We have a UN country team which coordinates the actions of various UN agencies working on the impacts of the droughts, which have been incredibly damaging for a large number of people in the northeastern part of Syria. But the UN country team needs funding. And if it has no funding, it simply will not be able to contribute to the response that is needed. The Syrian government itself is completely overstretched and unable to provide an effective answer. To my surprise, however, the UN agencies working there found it extremely difficult to obtain support from international donors. And although they tried to coordinate their answer, the WFP is sometimes funded, and the FAO is sometimes funded, and others are not funded, despite the fact that they try to have a well-coordinated response to the situation created by the drought in what they call the Syrian Drought Response Plan, which they adopted initially in July 2009 and have been revising since. So I ended up my mission in Syria in calling for more solidarity for Syria and for more support for these UN agencies who are doing a terrific job, but who, for the moment, obtain no more than 1/3 of the funds they would need to provide an effective answer. So what happens very concretely is that you have the WFP, for example, having to choose which villages to help, which communities to support, and having, therefore, to leave aside villages, communities, because they simply cannot cover all the areas affected. This should not be allowed to happen.